Hello and welcome back. It's Jason from the Crypto Cycle channel. Thanks for tuning in. Today we're going to continue the circles of risk review on the Bitmap. And today we're going to be covering the adoption curve and how we should perhaps value the Bitmap. So let's get straight into it. So here are the circles of risks that we've reviewed to date, which hopefully you've become familiar with. So just as a recap, we have reviewed 1, Bitmap as the standard. 2, how secure were the inscriptions that we done for securing our blocks? And lastly, what are the potential use cases for Bitmap? And today we're going to be looking at the adoption curve, as well as potentially looking at what the potential value of Bitmap could be today, perhaps, or in the short term. Okay, so firstly, we're going to go through the adoption of Bitmap. And I've brought up a model here from Ian Rogers. Please do check him out on Google. Just type his name in and you can do a bit of background research. Just to really summarize it, he's essentially come up with this model. So when there's like a new innovation or technology, there is this adoption curve where you can try and establish exactly where you may think we are in that process, from it becoming a very high level idea to becoming something fully adopted by the masses, almost like business as usual. So I've planted where I believe Bitmap is on this chart. And my personal take is that we are still at the innovator stage. And if you look at the descriptions on the screen, you can see what it says. So under innovators, it says, innovators are the first to try your innovation. They're curious, willing to take risks, and are actively seeking novelty. Some of you may say, but perhaps we're at the early adopters stage. And I get it, because maybe we have passed that innovation stage. But I'm looking at this from, technically nothing has been fully built and recognized yet on Bitmap. Now, there are a lot of projects, and I think it's attracting a lot of people into the space, which is fantastic. So that is why I still believe we're at this innovator stage. And maybe not that far away that once some real projects really start to take off and start to show the real potential of what Bitmap can provide, and this whole idea of what it can bring to this space, then I do think we are going to enter the early adopters. And I think it's worth us just reading actually what it takes to be at that stage. So perhaps even ourselves, we can try and recognize when we enter that phase. So what it says under Ian Rogers of under the early adopters, it says, this group represents opinion leaders and people willing to change with minimal reasoning. They're aware of a need to change without being told. And I think that's really, really interesting. And I've got another chart just here above, and that's basically this visionaries. And you can argue that, well, perhaps we're invested now in this because we can see the vision. I get it. I get it. But that's also the same as the innovators, because to be an innovator, you can also have the vision to see what it can potentially resolve as it's essentially trying to resolve a problem with a solution, isn't it? The problem is we want to create a metaverse that can be interconnected with each other because of all these previous projects that have existed and are essentially, or have been essentially, working in silos. So this is potentially the solution, that innovation, to try and bring all that together, a true metaverse. So that's where I believe we are on the adoption curve. So now we're going to look at how we can potentially value the bitmap. Now, this is just my own take on it. And I'm trying to find similarities, I guess, with how perhaps real estate would be valued. And I also did try to see if there were any models out there that I could use when trying to evaluate an asset, I guess, an asset class that is this early, when, there really isn't a project that's been fully built on it just yet. It's still an idea. It's ultimately a standard for something that we don't know quite yet what it's going to become. Of course, we believe it's going to be this amazing metaverse project that's going to come out of it, but that's obviously still yet to come. As I mentioned on the adoption curve, I believe we're still at the innovation stage. So, what I've firstly done was I went onto the currently known marketplaces, Magic Eden and Ordinal's Wallet, as a first port of call, really. And when I was looking at the stat information available, I really tried to understand, well, actually, with what I'm looking at, what is actually that important? So you're probably wondering, why have I got arrows pointing to the logos of both marketplaces, being Magic Eden and Ordinal's Wallet? Well, simply because, well, it's great that we've got recognition of Bitmap on these marketplaces, and ultimately, because if we want to sell our bitmaps in the future, there's a recognized place for us to sell it. So that's great. So, from a valuation perspective, it's important to know that there is somewhere we can list our bitmaps in the future if required. So that's good. So, when I was looking at the stats on both marketplaces, I've really, I guess, selected what I believe is the most important stats. One is the floor price. Obviously, that is technically the average value then of the bitmap. Secondly, how many of these bitmaps are in supply? Because obviously that's a real important factor. That's to do with supply and demand and the scarcity value of our bitmaps. And lastly, how many owners are there of the bitmaps, which is really important. So we've essentially established some levels of criteria here. So one, we have a marketplace. Two, we have floor price. Three, we understand how many bitmaps are in supply. And four, we can see how many owners there are. So that's great. However, it doesn't feel enough to be able to value how much potentially our bitmaps could be. So I used a website called nftstats.com, and they've got many projects associated to Ethereum. And they also have some which you could consider similar to Bitmap in terms of metaverse projects. So I've got one here on the screen, which is an example of voxels, which was considered previously as crypto voxels. And what I found interesting initially is that they've also used similar criteria to Magic Eden and Ordinal's Wallet, and that is they've got the floor price, they've got the total supply, and you'll notice they've got owners as well. Great. So we've established straight away a consistent approach of how we can essentially value this bitmap. Now, what I did like about NFT stats, however, is that they also have something called traits, which is what you can see on the screen, and this is just a very small snippet of the traits with regards to voxels. They've got area, they've got depth, they've got title, they've got width, they've got height, and the list actually goes on this project. And I guess similar to like some NFT projects, the traits are like the rarity, I guess. Like, if you look at crypto punks, it will say, well, if this one's got, I don't know, a cigar or some sunglasses or a hat, it tells you what the rarity is, how common it is for that crypto punk to have that trait, that feature in the image. So I think that's really important. And I want to use traits as a criteria element for how we're going to value our bitmaps. So putting the list together now, we've now got a very simple, high-level way of valuing Bitmap as a project in terms of how it ranks against other projects. Because I think it's very important that to be able to value Bitmap, well, we need to understand the market. We need to understand what other projects there are that we can compare against. So essentially, a comparison exercise needs to happen. So we can try and determine and reach a potential point of valuing Bitmap. So this is the list that we've got. You could call it a checklist, whatever it is. And this is it. So I've put down total supply, owner supply, how many owners there are. Are there traits? Is there a marketplace? Is there a metaverse already built on the project? And what is its current price affordability? Because I think that's really important. You know, we're investors. That is something we need to understand as, what is the risk classification on that? Really important. And I'm essentially now using a RAG rating, which simply stands for red, amber, and green. Because when I'm conducting this review, I want to get a feel really for each element from a scoring perspective. So when we can review Bitmap against other projects, it will just give us a sense perhaps of how good of an investment it is right now. And we'll do that before looking at any potential figures in terms of valuation in dollars. We're going to look at two projects, one called Decentraland and one called Sandbox. I'm going to discount voxels for the time being, purely because I didn't feel that it was comparable to Decentraland and Sandbox in terms of how many districts and parcels it had and the amount of owners. Even though Decentraland and Sandbox, from a supply perspective, which you'll find out shortly, do differ hugely from Bitmap in terms of how many districts there are. The stats that you see on the screen have been taken from nftstats.com. I'm applying the checklist that we've essentially created to carry out this valuation, and I'm assessing it against this project with the information available. So firstly, we're looking at total supply of Decentraland. I'm taking that the total supply of 98,073 is the amount of land, parcels, or districts available in Decentraland for someone to own. Well, because it's capped, I guess in one way you could look at it from a exclusivity perspective. There must be some value there. However, when it comes to owners, I haven't quite taken the same perspective, in that if the total number of land is 98,073, well, surely if only one person was to own one land, the maximum amount of owners is 98,073. Now, you could take it, well, that's like, that's scarcity. That's surely you're part of a limited club. Yes, I understand that. But I'm looking at this from a metaverse perspective. And I think many, many people should be able to own a piece of the metaverse. Now, I understand that under Bitmap, we've got the districts and then the potential of parcels, which creates it almost like an infinity supply. But to me, that is really attractive. Next, we've got traits. So, yes, Decentraland has various traits of classifying the different types of lands. So that gets a positive. Can you easily obtain one of these parcels or districts on Decentraland? Yes, there are marketplaces available, so that's good. Is there a metaverse available? Well, yes, there is. It's already been built. And I'm not quite sure if there's more developments happening with Decentraland, as it's not a project I follow very closely. If you do know, please do provide some comments if you know if there's any more developments happening within the Decentraland project. However, because I've been aware of this project for some time and I haven't seen so much happening with it, I've rated it an amber because it seems like it's stalled a little bit. So that's why I've perhaps given it a medium rating. And then in terms of affordability, well, as a new investor right now, to pick up one of these parcels or districts, floor price at the moment is $732, which equates to about 0.39 ETH. Now, looking at Sandbox, it also follows the similar scoring to Decentraland. So we can quickly go through it. So total supply, same as Decentraland, it's capped. There's 129,783 parcels or districts, whatever you want to call them. Again, I'm taking the same logic in terms of the owners. There are also traits, which is great. And yes, you can get Sandbox land on the marketplace. Is there a metaverse available? Yes. However, again, just like Decentraland, I'm not hearing much news out of it. I'm not hearing much development out of it. But again, if you've been following those spaces closely, please do put the comments and let us know what the latest is. And again, in terms of current price availability, I'm seeing that the cost at the moment works out to be about $560, which equates to about 0.3 ETH. Again, that seems rather high for something you're not too sure if it's going to progress any further with. So the one you've been waiting for, Bitmap. Hopefully you can see straight away that I'm valuing it in a totally different way to Decentraland and Sandbox, in that you can see a few more greens there. So let's just go through it. So total supply, I've put amber down because it's uncapped, because I appreciate that from, I guess, an investment perspective, you might think, well, that's like unlimited supply. However, just remember, there are only 800 and so thousand that have been produced at the moment. If you were to think about that for, let's say, another 10 years, and potentially we'd only have, let's say, 1.6 million of them, and you think versus the amount of people in the world, not everyone can own a bitmap, which I think is incredible. However, I also think it's fascinating because of this uncapped amount of bitmaps. It always allows new people to hold a bitmap, which I think is fantastic. So, in terms of owners, therefore, because they can continue to grow, I've given that a green. We also have traits. We've got sub-X lands, bitmap punks. We're already finding ways of differentiating and giving traits to these lands, which I think is fantastic. Of course, we can't forget the actual block numbers themselves. It's another trait. Are there a marketplace or marketplaces for us to be able to pick up the land? Yes, there are. Fantastic. Is there a metaverse available? Well, no, it's being developed. I haven't put a red on this because we are already seeing projects and certain developers starting to build certain projects which is surrounding the metaverse concept for Bitmap. So I'm excited about that. And for me at the moment, even though you could argue, well, it's not confirmed, there's nothing ready, perhaps you should show that red. I'm not, because This is bringing people into the space to develop a project for Bitmap with the metaverse idea. So that for me is exciting. Hence, I've given it a reasonable amber. And current price affordability, well, even though you might have missed the initial inscribing prior to the block out, which you could pick these up for $1, $2 plus gas fees. Even today on the secondary market, you can be picking some of these up for $7, $8 in terms of the floor price, because the floor price at the moment is 0.00024. That, to me, from an investor's perspective, looking at our risk point of view, it's like, well, okay, how much lower can it go? Well, yes, it can go to zero, of course. But the risk of putting in $7, $8 today and losing zero, to most of us, I'd like to hope we could absorb that pain. Whereas if you picked up one of the sandbox projects today or Decentraland projects today, you've got a lot more to lose, a lot more pain if the project goes totally south. So standing the projects side by side, I've basically grouped both Sandbox and Decentraland together because I ended up, unfortunately, giving them the same rating. So there was no point me separating it out. And comparing it to Bitmap, it's quite obvious at the moment that Bitmap seems to be the correct project to invest in, the project that ultimately seems like the better value. So I'm going to give this a little bit of a virtual estate agent valuation. And this may seem like I'm plucking a figure out of the air. However, I'm looking at it in comparison to Decentraland and Sandbox, which are projects that have been well established and at a much higher value. So at the moment, I'm suggesting that a reasonable valuation for a bitmap should be anywhere between $50 and $100 per bitmap. Now, that is as a floor price. I'm not looking at any special attributes to a block, if it's like a perfect looking CryptoPunk or if it's one of the historic blocks. I'm just looking at it as a standard floor price for a bitmap. I do see eventually, once projects start to be established and start creating metaverses on our bitmap, that price should increase to half a Bitcoin. And then once the metaverse and the projects are fully established, I can't see why not. Why a bitmap would cost less than a Bitcoin on the basis that one of these plots or one of these districts is scarcer than Bitcoin. There's less of these than there are Bitcoin. I actually truly believe that one of these bitmaps could be worth many Bitcoin because of the scarcity in these blocks and in these bitmaps, essentially. To give, I guess, extra ammunition to my suggestion that in the near future, in the short term future, that a bitmap could potentially cost between $50 and $100 as a floor price. And bearing in mind, I am being extremely conservative here. I think that's an absolute reasonable amount, and I believe the absolute worth of these should be a lot higher. However, I want to take a more cautious approach on the basis that going from where we are today, $8, to somewhere between $50 and $100 in the near short term does not seem unreasonable, especially as more and more people become aware of the project and want to get involved with Bitmap. Now, a few things going for Bitmap that again I see it having a higher valuation than today's floor price. And I'm also looking at Bitmap on the basis of what it has as a competitive advantage against the other projects. So one real big factor for me with regards to Bitmap is that Your bitmap is a district, and then you can subdivide it into parcels, create your own communities, your own worlds through your bitmaps. I don't believe the other projects can do that and that they sit in their own silo environment. Another aspect is that the blocks themselves, because they're this organic virtual byproduct of the blocks being confirmed on the blockchain, and that this is like a natural organic representation of all the transactions within the block, they've essentially then created their own piece of artwork, which again, I believe also carries its value. And not forgetting the actual block numbers themselves. Some of these have historic and sentimental value. On top of that, each block is essentially different. It has its own attributes. Again, something that these other projects don't have. It's almost like they have their own fingerprints to a certain degree. And lastly, what I really truly believe is its ultimate value is that it's built on the Bitcoin blockchain, and the amount of blocks in comparison to the amount of Bitcoin there is that it's much scarcer than Bitcoin. You may be thinking, well, when do I think this $50 to $100? When might that happen? And I'm thinking perhaps we're going to have to just wait a little while. And perhaps once we enter that next stage of the early adopters, that we might start to see those valuations start creeping up. And like I said, I do believe that this is a very conservative appraisal and that it should really go for a lot higher, but we will see. So you may be asking, with this entire review, where does that bring the risk of where we are in terms of adoption of Bitmap and what the potential value of the bitmap can be? You shouldn't be surprised. It gets a green pass on the basis that where we are today, it being such a low value, and against or versus the potential it has in the future, and also bearing in mind how early we are on the adoption curve, this, from a risk perspective, is extremely low, and it's actually a very positive position to be in. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.